Okay, YouTube, you can. Maybe I should do this better. I'm thinking I'm going to end up cutting this to pieces anyway. So let's start from here. Hello, YouTube. My name's James PFP. This is not the Banjo Cast. No screencasting, no streaming for the next several months, at least 2 more months, plus a few days. But that's another story. Tonight, I'm planning to sit down and watch this video, which is Jordan Peterson being interviewed by the, how shall I put it, the infamous Russell Brand. Doesn't need much more to be said. It was recorded just this past month, and I've been holding off on watching it. This is my reaction as well as thinking out loud video to this interview. Here is the interview in question. Here goes nothing. Oh, I'm not getting any audio. Properties. Huh. Wow, if I haven't got any audio, this isn't going to work. Why no desktop audio? Properties. Maybe I got to do this way. This would make sense to me. I'm using these headphones and this microphone. These headphones are USB. I suspect this is the issue.
My guest on Under the Skin today is
Boom.
Dr. Jordan Peterson, clinical psychologist, professor of psychology at the University of Toronto and author of books including Maps of Meaning, The Architecture of Belief, and his recent bestseller, 12 Rules for Life. First garnering mainstream media attention in 2016 when he objected to compelled speech legislation in Canada, he has steadily been making a name for himself as a voice of the anti-political correctness movement and has cultivated a slew of predominantly young male followers, touted by some as an academic rock star and the most important thinker in the West, and by others as a provocateur and firebrand of the alt-right. He is also part of
A provocateur and firebrand of the alt-right. Interesting thing to be saying here from this prepared statement, Mr. Brand.
Thinker in the West, and by others as a provocateur and firebrand.
In the West and by
Predominantly young male followers, touted by some as an academic rock star and the most important thinker in the West, and by others as a provocateur and firebrand of the alt-right. He is also part of a new internet-savvy group of controversial thinkers that have been deemed the intellectual dark web. Jordan Peterson, thank you for coming on Under the Skin.
Thanks very much for the invitation.
What's funny about, he's already grimacing a little bit because it's a prepared statement which allows Brand to say, well, I didn't actually say any of that. What I was doing was summarizing what other people say about you. I also would like to point out that Russell Brand used to do a different show called The Trues. I don't know if he still does that or not.
Excited to speak to you because my interest in your work was either prior to or somehow abstract from the controversies that have brought you to mainstream attention. And I was thinking then, as a clinical psychologist, I was wondering about how interwoven the relationship between psychology and mythology and archetypes is.
Well, one of the things that happened, I think, was that when the political scandal broke around me in Canada, which was in September 2016, people came to check me out because of the scandal, but they stayed because of the psychology. By that time, I already had about 300 hours of YouTube lectures, which probably saved me in some sense, because when I was being
I'd agree with you
protested against, say, and warned by the university about what I was doing because it was hypothetically contravening the law, people went on my site to find out what sort of person I was, and I had pretty much everything I'd said to students in the last 30 years taped and ready for what public viewing. My website had already had about 1 million hits then, and people got very interested in this psychology. And it's not surprising to me, because what I've been teaching since 1993 is, I think, unbelievably practical. Now, I'm a clinical psychologist, so I've always been interested in trying to improve people's mental health. And I viewed putting the lectures online as part and parcel of that. It's like there were a lot of smart clinicians in the 20th century. They learned a lot about how you could put your life together, decrease anxiety, decrease
clipping
depression,
showing up here.
orient yourself more effectively in your communication and with regards to your long-term plans, and understand your dreams and position yourself properly in the world. And it's been a real pleasure and a privilege to be able to bring that work to the broader attention of, well, now it's millions of people. It's not surprising. It helps, you know. I mean, these people were geniuses. So the fact
You're
that
talking about what Freud,
Jung, Carl Adler, Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow, there's a slew of existential psychologists in the 1950s, humanists in the 1960s. There's probably a dozen or so, maybe 15 of great clinicians who laid the groundwork really for clinical psychiatry and also
Trying to
for
figure out what is
psychology.
this.
And also developed psychotherapy and therapeutic conversations as we know it.
Like all emergent
Looks like a
myths,
light,
it must
right?
bear the inflection of the culture in which it was conceived.
Can you hear him saying it?
This is
Fatty.
my guest on Under the Skin today
Oh,
is Dr.
sorry.
Jordan Peterson.
To the broader attention of, well, now it's millions of people. It's
33.
not surprising. It helps. You know? I
33.
mean, these people were geniuses. So the
I
fact
can hear
that
him
Talking
saying
about
it.
what Freud,
Jung, Carl Adler, Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow,
33.
there's a slew of existential psychologists in the
33.
1950s, humanists
30.
in the 1960s.
33.
There's probably a dozen or so, maybe
33.
15 of great clinicians who laid the groundwork really for clinical psychiatry and also for clinical psychology, and they and also developed psychotherapy and therapeutic conversations as we know it.
Like all emergent myths, it must bear the inflection of the culture in which it was conceived. This is why I am particularly interested in the areas of psychiatry and psychology that are resourced from older materials, such as
Resourced?
mythology and archetypes. And I know that particularly in some of the names that you mentioned, mythology is used as to supply a common language.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the right way of looking at it to some degree. It's like we act out stories. That's why we tell stories. Right?
Okay.
That's why people are attracted to stories.
Fair.
Because stories are the best way of describing our lives. And stories have a pattern, or they wouldn't be stories. I mean, that's why there's comedy, right? That's where everything turns out the way everyone wants it to. That's why there's tragedy, when everything falls apart. That's why there's adventure and romance. And that covers a lot of territory, right? Adventure, romance, comedy, tragedy. And, you know, people like Carl Jung in particular, he was the deepest analyst of stories, I would say. There's a Romanian guy named Mircea Eliade, who was also a very historian of religions, who was also a very remarkable scholar and very useful if you're interested in understanding the fundamental patterns of stories. But Jung was very interested in the deepest structure of stories. Imagine that humans have languages. Every human culture has a language. But languages have a commonality, right? They're all languages, and they have a universal grammar. That was Noam Chomsky's great discovery.
Yes.
And stories are like that. Every culture has its own stories, but the stories have a universal grammar. And so Jung was the first person who laid the groundwork for discovering what that universal grammar was. And it's crucially important work. You know, you could say that what a religion is a set of stories that comes very close to the grammar of stories. They aren't stories that you can dispense with. The hero story is like that.
Jung, you say, did great early work in mapping out what might be the etymology or the sort of the ulterior truth from which these patterns emerge.
Yep.
My interest in this is that because like, when Jung works with image and mandala in, say, for example, the Red Book, what is suggested by our ability to observe patterns and the fact that we respond to patterns is that there is some kind of universal frequency that we are responding to.
Well, I had two clients who knew nothing about Jungian psychotherapy, both of whom were badly fragmented. They were both women. They both had, I would say, variants of post-traumatic stress disorder. They had other problems as well. And both of them produced spontaneous drawings. that were first very fragmented and disorganized, and then as they put themselves together and were ordering themselves, let's say, they produced drawings that were increasingly symmetrical and regular and took on the mandala-like configurations that Jung described. And so that was absolutely fascinating to watch that. And he thought of those patterns as manifestations of spontaneous order. And you see them in cathedrals.
Yes.
You know, the great rose windows in cathedrals are mandalas.
Okay.
And the rose windows and the entire cathedral structure is something like, it's hard to describe exactly, but a cathedral is something like the optimal balance of structure and light. It's something like that. And the Gothic cathedrals are also reminiscent of forests. Right?
Now, he's talking out of his field here a little bit, but okay, if you say so, Mr. Peterson, but I'm not going to be going to the bank and like putting that into a safety deposit box.
They're arching branches and the light's coming through, like the light coming through the leaves. It's reminiscent of that. But there's something about the cathedral that expresses the idea of perfect structure, and there's something about
it? Well, maybe it's the architecture. Jeez, who knows?
a mandala that expresses.
You know what's funny about a cathedral is if it doesn't have ongoing effort put into the cathedral, it will fall down of its own accord because it isn't fucking perfect.
That, and something about music that expresses that as well. And they're all ways of trying to symbolically represent how things could be if they.
Or how things are in some cases. You could be. It is a piece of light shining in on his jacket here. It was blue first, but now it's turning whiter.
They were put in the proper state of
same light
balance.
that's on his
Harmony.
forehead.
Harmony is the right way of thinking.
Harmony.
About harmony.
Yes.
Yeah.
I suppose all of
Through the
these
window light,
forms,
look.
the idea that there could perhaps be across the various disciplines, strata and forms of
reflection of a
expression,
shadow.
some kind of golden rule, seem to infer
A refraction, in fact.
oneness, a truth that in earlier forms of language may be expressed as the idea of God, wholeness, oneness. Where do you stand on the? Do you believe?
God is the same as wholeness or oneness. God is the same as oneness. Oh my God. No, not oh my God. Oh my. What the? What is this guy smoking? And can I really get more of that rather than what I'm smoking?
God.
Well, the
Oneness. Anyone who believes that monotheism is the pinnacle of human religious development needs to have their head examined.
Jungian idea is that there's not much distinction between what Jung described as the archetype of the self and the idea of God. And the self would be something like the totality of your being across time.
Okay.
Jung thought of Christ as a symbol of the self. And the reason for this is a very profound idea. It's an amazingly profound idea. I mean,
Go on, unpack that
well,
a bit.
Well, you can if you think about the story of Christ from a psychological perspective, and you strip it down to its essence, what you essentially see is that the story of Christ is the ultimate tragedy.
Really? It's the ultimate tragedy? A passion. What? What's he talking about?
And the reason for that is that the ultimate tragedy is the worst possible thing happening to the best possible person.
Oh, well, again, I have to take your word for it, sir.
Right? That's
I didn't notice the collar around your neck.
the ultimate tragedy. That's what makes it an archetype. You can't go past that for tragic. Right?
What? I don't know, man. I think the actual tragedy of it is, in fact, if you want to try to sell it to humans, normally the way that you sell it to a human being is to say, imagine a person who lives longer than their child does. That's tragic, isn't it?
So it's an innocent man who is completely sinless, who is working on
Again, like I say, imagine someone who lives longer than their child does.
behalf of only the good and the truth, broken and
I mean, what's the whole deal with Isaac and fucking Abraham, right? Or is it Isaac? Yeah. Abraham as to slew somebody is ordered to, and then there's a last minute retrieval. Is it Isaac?
destroyed early and young and betrayed as well. So that's the ultimate tragedy. And so then
young. Yeah, you got to be young.
There's a comedic element to it in the technical sense, because a comedy has a happy ending.
Technically, wouldn't it require a flaw? You know, like for it to work comedically, there would need to be a flaw.
Well,
A floor?
in Christ. Is it that he is God
God dang.
made flesh? Is that the flaw?
Well, it depends on what you mean by comedy. I mean, we tend as modern people.
You get the Garden of Gethsemane, don't you, fucking Russell? Jesus Christ, this guy.
To think of comedy as something that's humorous, but technically, if you're looking at story structure, a comedy is just a story that has a happy ending.
Wow. Jordan Peterson defanging comedy. Right, you can't have satire in comedy, can you, Jordan?
Right, that has a positive ending. And
That's
of course,
all.
it's the resurrection story that makes Christ's story a comedy.
That's a funny way of putting it, Mr. Peterson. Makes it a comedy. Makes it a farce. Makes it fake news. Makes it fake news, Mr. Peterson. Makes it fake news, doesn't it, Mr. Peterson?
Ta-da!
Yeah, exactly. It's like, yeah, this went so badly wrong.
Fake news, and for the camera, ladies and gentlemen, I think I could probably drop the mic here at 9 minutes into the video.
But there's this possibility of resurrection, and the way that I read that psychologically, and I'm not trying to make any comments about the metaphysics of it, is that there's a part of people, the self, the Jungian self, let's say,
The capital S self
that
of
capital
Jung.
S self, yes, that
Digo.
that is capable of sustaining itself across successive deaths and rebirths, and everyone really understands this. It's one of the things that's most fun to teach people, because you know, when you're moving through life and you have a plan or a dream and it shatters, you know, someone dies or a relationship breaks apart, or you have a terrible upset in your career, or you become ill in some unexpected way, then everything around you falls apart and you plunge into a chaotic underworld.
The belly.
A chaotic underworld? What is he talking about? What is he talking about? A chaotic underworld when you lose everything in the real world? Underworld to who, Mr. Peterson?
If the whale.
Yeah, it's
People we call him Mister?
exactly right. Yes, exactly that. And then maybe you stay there, because it isn't necessarily the case that people get out. You know, people die. People are in despair permanently. But frequently, something tragic and terrible befalls you, and you fall apart, and you learn something profound as a consequence, and you put yourself back together, and when you come back out, you're more than you were when you went in. And that's happening at a small scale. Every time you learn something, you know, if you ever...
Okay, I can actually follow the argument there. Yes, in that sense, that's why anyone's IQ is not something which is carved in stone, never to change. So that once you encounter other people, because intelligence is a shared trait, you incrementally get a little bit more intelligent, regardless of what the flavor or indeed the value of that intelligence happens to be. It could be that you're more intelligent to everyone else around you, but you're all fucking wrong about something. So thus, you're not actually that much more intelligent in the broader scale.
really learn something, it's usually painful. It usually means that you have to recognize that you're wrong in some important way.
Fair
you
enough.
have to let that part of you that's wrong die, and then you have to...
You need to let the part that's wrong die. You have to abandon some conception, perhaps, some idea which you haven't, but I mean, to say that this idea must therefore die is being a little bit dramatic, if you ask me. I'm chuckling with the comedy of it.
Let a new part of you... Okay, so the self, imagine that
There's a happy ending.
you undergo a series of transformations in your life. There are collapses into the chaotic underworld, and then...
So this is why I got to be honest here. I've got a bone to pick with CBC Radio. Every now and again I hear things on CBC Radio which just piss me off. It's the number one reason that in this current video there's a clock ticking up here saying Eschaton imminent, false. That's the reason why. CBC is the reason. And one of the things I heard on CBC once upon a time was that 50% of the population will suffer a traumatic event during the course of their lifetime. And I'm going to tell you, that figure really should be a little bit closer to 100%. Don't you agree, Mr. Peterson? Don't you agree?
A series of transformations in your life. There are collapses into the chaotic underworld, and then
You mean traumatic experiences of some kind?
many resurrections. That happens continually, and that's what molds your character.
Yes.
The
Oh, wow. So we're all traumatized. Thank you very much.
self is this thing that manages the transformations that manages all those transformations.
Period.
So you could say, here's another way of thinking about it.
He's very mean, isn't he? He wants to take all those transformations, whatever curve that they did. I should use a pen and a fucking... whatever curve that delineates, he wants to draw a line. That's the self. The line is the mean self, if you know what I mean.
You could identify with what you understand. That's what ideologues do. You could identify with what you don't understand, and that's what sort of seekers after truth.
Identify with what you don't understand. Seekers after truth. The question remains, can you frame the question in such a way that you're actually going to get an answer? Mr. Peterson, there are ways of doing that.
Identify with. Or you could identify with the process of moving between those states. You know, sometimes you know what
Self.
you're doing, you know where you
Remember?
are, you're in control. And you can become arrogant and identify with that and then become too static about it, right? Or you can be in despair and everything is chaotic and you can identify with that, in which case you're nihilistic. Or you can view yourself as the thing that moves across the transformations. And that's the right way to conceptualize yourself, is you're the thing that maintains constancy across transformations.
One imagines that your experience with the controversies around the linguistics and legislation in Canada must have felt like one of those plunges into the depths on some level, would you say? Did you feel a sense of personal tragedy and fear and a concern about consequence, or that there may be no way back, that it could represent a kind of death? Or did it indeed represent a kind of death for you, for one for which you are subsequently grateful?
Well, I would say for the first 4 months, when the political scandal broke, it was very unsettling for a variety of reasons. The first was that my occupation as a clinical psychologist and as a professor was definitely in doubt. I mean, the university sent me 2 warning letters, and that's a standard HR procedure. Usually you get 3, right? The third warning is stop or your
else.
Consequences won't be good. If you work in human resources, you have to, especially if you're going to go after someone with tenure, you have to document their misbehavior. You have to provide them with warnings. You have to tell them how they could get back on the right track. And then if you have documented refusal to comply with the warnings, then they have grounds for dismissal. So we're very worried about
You were
that.
close. You were close to to some kind of personal or professional annihilation, or certainly damage. Now, for people, just in case, on the off chance that there are people that are unaware of the details, I'll say it as I understand it, and then you can tell me how I've got it wrong. The government changed the law saying
And this is the way it's going to be, is it, Russell?
there are neutral nouns that mandatorily would be applied to people identified as transgender. You said that is an imposition on freedom of speech, whilst I would make a decision whether or not I would. If I was meeting a transgender person, I would talk to them how they wanted to be talked to. The fact that you're making it law is an impediment on the freedom of speech, and then it kicked off.
Yeah, that's a good summary of it. Yeah, I would say. I mean, my sense, there were 2 things I objected to. One was that the government, for the first time in the history of Canada, and really in a move that was unprecedented in English common law, under English common law, actually mandated the content of voluntary speech. And I thought, I don't care what your excuse is for doing that. That's no-go zone as far as I'm concerned. That's not happening.
Even though, right, this is what it seems to me like, sort of, help me to understand this, right?
Yeah.
Because what I'm always interested in, I think, is power and where power is.
Yeah.
And, like, you know, I subsequently looked at what your views are towards, like, sort of post-structuralist and the alt-left. And, like, a lot of things I think, yeah, you're right. That you know, I agree with that. But what the reason I think that the sort of a controversy had fuel on both sides, the reason it had an engine on the other side, is because it seems that, and indeed having watched other interviews and the objections that other interviewers have presented to you, it seems to me that a transgender person is in a position of vulnerability. But you're saying this is not about transgender. This is about language and it's about oppression. That's what you're saying.
Well, that was my claim, is that this wasn't about transgenderism at all, and I would
about
say,
which you got no strong view, I'm guessing, or
I don't have the sort of strong view that I would think I was sufficiently qualified to make political statements about.
yeah, like
It's very
Chappelle
complicated.
goes.
I mean,
I
I
don't
mean-
understand it, but it's not my.
Well, I basically look at the research, you know, and I mean, the research for transgender kids is quite clear, is that most of them desist by the time they're 18. You know, and I'm basically guided by
Whereas
because
this
I'm
in
a
like
social
Scandinavia,
scientist.
where they check that stuff out.
Yeah,
more.
yeah, that's right. That's right. Now people have criticized that research, like all research, but it's the best research that's been done on the topic. But the other problem was with the legislation was that I felt that it was an attempt by the radical left to gain the linguistic territory and to define the terms of the debate.
Fair
You know,
enough.
and I thought that was very dangerous. So I was objecting to that as well.
I feel you. Now, the thing that I'm interested in here, Jordan, is I don't feel like the radical left is a very powerful group. Am I being naive here? I mean, possibly in the world of academia, particularly, like I feel like they are sort of representative of a coalition built around identity
Oh,
politics.
okay.
issues that
Hang on a minute. Hang on. Well, you hear the word coalition? You know what that means? There's meetings and planning. So coalition is another way of actually saying conspiracy, provided the coalition is involved in a criminal activity. You're funny, right? Coalition, ladies and gentlemen.
particularly important to people. Like my general view is, if you identify something, cool, no problem. It's none of my business. That's basically
Where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there will you also find a lying motherfucker like this son of a bitch.
my opinion. I'll call you what you want me to call you. I'm happy that you're speaking to me. But do you see a sort of the the sort of extreme left, or
I mean, I got more of a
as
beard
a
than a neck.
powerful organisation, like
Well,
you know?
certainly in the universities.
So
because
what they can get what done? They could, for example, they could get that legislation passed.
Yes.
See, the thing that I'm doing differently than most of the other leftists that I know is I'm allowing them to actually speak when I'm making noises and the like. Sometimes I actually pause and say what I'm going to say, and then hit pause.
That.
They-
Well, and I think the situation is different in the U.S. than it is in other countries. I think the political situation in the U.S. is actually more balanced than it is in most Western countries, because I would say the left, the radical left, has a pretty decent hold on a number of institutions, and first and foremost of those would be the universities. But then the conservatives, aren't without power in the United States, because they occupy most of the elected positions now.
Do you?
But it's not the case in Canada.
You don't want to be identified with any of those groups, am I right? Like, you wouldn't say that you're a person that's on the right or the left or conservative, or really. I noticed you didn't say
No,
whether
well,
or not you believed in God.
Well, my political views are complicated because I'm temperamentally liberal, because I'm high in openness, which is a creativity dimension, and people who are high in openness tend to be liberal because they like free-flowing information, and they like, what would you say, fluid boundaries, because...
I have to ask you, why is it that Russell on the left is so attached to God?
information can move back and forth across the boundaries.
How amazing.
So
you
temperamentally,
reject,
I'm like that.
Ideologically, you reject these taxonomies, and you identify basically on the basis of research, like empiricism in a sense. You could say, like, I'm an open-minded type of person.
Like a leftist who's a materialist. Oh,
This language is clinical psychology, so your
Yeah.
What's
your
the
faith
problem?
is clinical
merde.
psychology.
It's
and
research. Well, I've done a fair bit of research in my lab on
Yes.
the temperamental predictors of political predisposition, and we can predict what parties people are going to align
He's talking to Russell Brand.
themselves with by studying their personality. So liberal left types are high in a trait called openness, and open people, you're a very open person. And you can tell because
Open like a book.
you think laterally,
Oh,
you
yeah.
have an idea, and then it reminds you of a whole bunch of other ideas.
All this stuff,
And
yeah.
so you'll move laterally across ideas.
I've done this too.
And a more conservative person, they'll stay within the category. And
They'll attempt to. There are these things what he calls categories, right? These categories, I also look at them, well, a bit like if you're looking into a filing cabinet. The categories are the different file dividers that got a label on them. So you flip between the categories to get to the particular information you might be looking for when you're looking in a filing cabinet. Categories also, though, could be the baffles in a fuel tank or a water tank on a vehicle which moves. So you don't want the inside sloshing around too much and throwing the vehicle out of balance, especially if it's flying through the air and it's loaded with flammable fuel. So you put a bunch of dividers inside the tank. It's called baffles. And then you could call each of the different compartments categories if you wish. And I think this is the reason why he really This is why Peterson normally speaks in favor of categories, is the control of the political weight inside the machine, which is what, if you ask me, Mr. Brand had been originally asking about. Let's see whether or not Brand can draw the distinction when we get into categories.
So your conversational style is marked by divergences. And
Yes.
that's actually called divergent thinking. It's a hallmark of
Is it
creativity.
good?
Well, it's good if you want to be creative. The problem with there's a price for everything, hey? The price for creativity.
Hey, there's a price for everything, hey? Let me tell you about it.
Is that it's hard to catalyze an identity because you're interested in everything. That's the first thing. And your interest will flip from one thing
Sorry. I was thinking about French jokes. I really
to another. So one of the problems that creative people have, well, they have
wish
two.
I knew
One
more
is
French.
They have a hard time establishing an identity. And the second is they have a hard time monetizing their creativity.
Oh, truth.
It's very difficult to be a creative person and make money. You can make money for other people, but usually you're dead by then, so it's not very helpful for you.
Jordan, both of those problems
Thanks, man. Thanks.
are
Usually you're dead by then, he said. But did he wave his right hand at the same
And
time?
make money. You can make money for other people, but usually you're dead by then, so it's not very helpful for you.
Jordan, both of those problems are as a result of external structures, the imposition of external structures on the individual, i.e. make money. That's a problem of capitalism and commerce more broadly. And the other
Is it a problem with commerce? No, I think the problem is not so much in the making the money. It's how do I put this? Most money which is made is created via the banking system in some form of credit. That's the problem with the money system. The idea that you exchange some good or some service which you can provide and get and in return you are paid in some form of exchangeable credit voucher. That's actually from the left. I mean, that didn't come down from the banks necessarily. It's also a thing that workers would want to have, especially if the currency you're being paid in has a meaningful value to the thing that you do. So is money the problem, or is capitalism the problem?
one of identity, similarly, so is there a sort of a peculiar contradiction in around identity in that, like, it seems to me on one level that you reject taxonomies. You're saying that these systems, e.g. if you
You just talked about staying inside of one category.
say women are being paid less money, your argument would be, well, hold on a minute, there are other factors other than gender here. I
It's
don't
like an
agree with the
intersectional
data.
argument. It's a funny thing because the intersectional feminists always claim that you should take other factors into account, right? Woman, man isn't enough. White,
Yes.
black isn't enough. Well, I
Yes.
say, well, there's a pay gap between men and women, but it's not only due to gender.
It's
Due to all sorts of
multiple,
things, and you have to take them into
multivariable.
account. So it's really an intersectional argument. So
Is
it's
an
quite funny that I get hell
intersectional-
for it.
It's intersectional in the sense that any function which is going to calculate it, Mr. Brand, is going to be talking about where one graph overlaps in another graph because you're counting for two different factors which are intersecting. The same as your little Venn diagram has two circles.
It's an intersectional argument. So
It's a Boolean argument for that matter. We're looking for the place where these two intersect. We need just
do you feel then, because what I sense is happening, like trying to understand where like our worldviews would align and
Yeah.
where
I'm going to ask you, anyone who's actually watched my channel for a while, have I not done a better job in explaining how perhaps to think about consciousness than this man has in the last little while?
potentially there would be opposition between you and I. What I'm trying, because it's
When it comes to categories, is not that kind of thinking. The whole Hegelian breakdown.
it seems to me, looking at your work, he's like, oh, I don't agree with the way that this information is being
I know for a fact this man is part of a cult.
compiled. I don't agree with the
I mean a specific cult.
assumptions that you're trying to saddle that piece of data with. It seems to me that it's about critical thinking, a very post-structuralist idea, but also what I have noticed is that much of
There's a cameraman.
many of your theories seem to be subsequently alloyed to some
Alloyed.
unpleasant ideas around sort of tradition, conservatism, oppression, even. How do you feel about that? Because it would be well easy for you to, like I think you have said, I don't care about whether people are transgender or not. I just don't want no oppressive laws around language. But it would also be easy for you to say, I don't think there's any, I've heard you say on the news, fairness. But it does seem that there is some mischief somehow in you around the issues such as gender inequality.
Well, there's probably lots of mischief in me around all sorts of things. But I think that mostly I look at the political landscape from the perspective of an informed, biologically oriented social scientist. And so when people lay out their particular theories, they don't sound outdated to me. Like one example is that the left, for example, tends to lay the blame for inequality at the feet of the Western hierarchical structure and capitalism. That's just wrong. Inequality is a problem, and it's the proper concern of the left, I would say, and it's a proper concern because inequality is a deadly problem, but it's way more serious than anything you can blame on capitalism. Every single society that's ever been studied, for as far back as people are able to study, suffers from the problem of inequality. I work with this Native American tribe in northern Vancouver. I'm a member of the tribe, actually. Now they're called the Kwakwaka'wakw people. And
say that again. That's not the sort of word you can get away with just saying once.
Kwakwaka'wakw.
That's a tough bit of native language right there.
It's a tough one to spell.
Because the problem with me is I'd say too many quas.
They're brilliant artists. They're part of that West Coast native tradition of art, which I think is
my
great
tongue.
tradition.
What type of art is that?
Dramaticus qua
exaggerated
uncertitatum
eyes.
you're looking at.
It's kind of a hallucinogenic art in some sense, and
These
the
people are down
figures,
with
the
the
animals
shamanism.
are very graphic. They're very graphically portrayed. I would say they have large almond eyes and bright colors, and the art's very beautiful. The Haida art is probably the best known variant of it, but the Kwakwaka'wakw is similar to that. And they used to have this ceremony called the potlatch, and what you would do in a potlatch is usually you had to be comparatively wealthy to have a potlatch, and you would give away everything you had. Whoa. And that was their solution to inequality, because what would happen in the native societies, just like every other society, is that as time progressed, everything would become owned by a very small number of people. And that's a bad recipe for long-term stability. So they would have these giant parties that would often last weeks, where the rich would demonstrate their wealth and also, I suppose, their commitment to their own
culture,
provision, their own capacity to provision the future by giving everything away. And I'm only using that as an example to show that the problem of inequality is not something that you can lay at the feet of capitalism. It's a way worse problem than that.
You can now, you couldn't then.
I agree with you, and I understand. But you're saying that capitalism occurs far too late down the line to be the genesis of a problem
absolutely.
That's indigenous to human beings.
Also...
But what about some of these, and
capitalism? No. Human cultures, along with Dunbar's number. This is part of the reason why Dunbar's number exists. Is what we might consider this. We might look at this in for another reason. That it's that endemic that we have a predisposition to preferring a fairly small number, and with a number that small, we're only talking about a factorial of 6, 7. It's not it's 7 degrees to Kevin Bacon. That's what it is.
I would be very careful too. I have no problem saying I believe in God all day long. I believe in God, but I would be a little more cautious about saying, I agree with this party or that party, because I sort of don't feel that my political views are demonstrated within the sphere of mainstream politics, because they operate on such a prohibited frequency because of the power of transnational organisations, the irrelevance of national sovereignty when it comes to ordinary people asserting power. So it becomes sort of kind of too complex for me. But
the irrelevance of national sovereignty? Huh.
What I can see is interesting about, say, even if you take sort of socialism and perhaps, like I suspect or sense that one of the issues you take is its sort of continual annihilation of like take out God, then take out man, then take out woman, then take out everything, till all we have is this miasma of meaninglessness.
I wouldn't necessarily put that at the feet
I just made it up.
I wouldn't necessarily
just
put
made
it
it
at
up.
the feet of
Thank you.
socialism per se.
What would you say that is?
Well, that's a complicated one. I mean,
Is it happening, or am I wrong?
I think it's happened in many ways. I think a lot of that is a consequence of the hypothetical conflict between science and religion.
Do you think
that's
hypothetical? Or?
Well, because I'm not so sure there is a conflict. There can't,
Materialism
there
and
can't
spiritualism?
be a fundamental conflict because the world is one thing fundamentally, right? Everything fits together.
Cool.
So there can't actually be a conflict. If the religious realm exists and the scientific realm exists, they have to be unifiable at some point. Now, the more materialistic scientists, the more atheistic scientist types like Sam Harris would deny essentially that there's any validity to religious dogma, although he certainly believes that there's a spiritual element to life. So I think that what happened, at least...
Is there validity to religious dogma? Okay. The fact that we've tried to inscribe some dogma upon the hearts of people, and I say these with air quotes, not because I don't believe in heart. I do believe in the heart, the organ, and I also recognize that human beings spiritually will tap their chests when they're talking about their heart. But the heart which feels this is up here. And so we have this thing called dogma, which tries to make concrete an idea inside the head and say that idea must never, ever, 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 ever change. It must be absolute, this idea. But they continually pound it in for thousands and thousands of years, and still we don't like it.
In part, and this is why the work of Jung, to return to Jung, is so
They call this the devil, I suppose, but
important, is that we didn't understand that truth comes
Sam Harris.
in different forms depending on its application. It's a tricky thing. There's the truths that apply when you're
It's a tricky thing.
attempting to describe the transformations
should
of the
pause.
material world. And there's the truths that apply when you're trying to determine how it is that you should act while you're alive. And those have to come into alignment, but they're not in alignment right now. And my sense, and this is a sense that's been developed, at least in part from reading the great psychoanalysts, is that fictional accounts, metafictional accounts, even like biblical accounts, which are mythological, are stories about how it is that people should act, not stories about what the material structure of the world is. This is also where the fundamentalists have it wrong, as far as I'm concerned, because the fundamentalists like to think that the account in Genesis is a scientific theory that can be stacked up against other scientific theories.
In short, they are materializing the mythic.
Yes, that's right. And
which is unhelpful.
Well, it's not a help. Well, first of all, it doesn't even make any sense, because the materialist types, in any real sense, weren't around until about 500 years ago, right? This was all established by Descartes and Bacon, and well, Galileo was another player, but those were the two major players that established the scientific method. There weren't scientists before then. I mean, there were very intelligent people who could analyze the structure of the world. The ancient Greeks were obviously very rational and capable of philosophy, but there was no science until 500 years ago. And so obviously the people who wrote Genesis weren't scientists, because there weren't any scientists. So whatever, and I also think that the world they describe is it's much better considered the world of experience than the world of material reality. And well, look, here's an idea. You can try this one on for size. I've been trying this on audiences for quite a long time. So modern people say they think the world is made out of things. But if you watch them, that's not how they act. They act like the world is made out of potential. And so they'll even say things to each other like, "You're not living up to your potential." You might say, well, what is this potential that you're talking about? You can't. It doesn't have a color, it doesn't have a shape, it doesn't have a mass, it doesn't have a size. Like, there's nothing about it that has a material element. Yet, you believe that you're not living up to your potential. Everyone feels guilty about that. If someone accuses you of that, you feel bad about it. So then I might say, well, you also live not as if you confront a world of things, but as if you confront a world of possibility. And you hold each other accountable that way. Because I could say, well, you're not making all the use of the possibility that's presented to you because you're not living properly. You're not living honestly. You're not aiming high enough. You're not making everything of that potential that might be made.
I think Peterson, in this part of the interview, which is being conducted by Russell Brand, is trying some hypotheses which he's made on guesses things that Brand may have heard before in his life. Am I right or am I wrong? I think he's not scattershotting it. He's taking a fairly educated guess, probably with some intelligence from other people, I mean. Some ideas of what maybe to expect. Not only what he's observed on his own or research, so to speak.
What's that potential? Well, in religious stories, that potential, and you see this in the first story in Genesis, is that potential is what God creates order out of at the beginning of time. That's the idea that's expressed in that book, is that there's a potential, whatever that is, and that something acts on it to bring it into reality. And there's a deeper idea in there too, which is a profound idea, which is that the potential, the actuality that you bring out of potential with truth is good. And so there's an ethical element to the story as well.
So we shouldn't kill because Cain? Shouldn't kill a murderer, I mean, because Cain? What?
Well, and I actually think that that's a great truth. I do believe that's the case, that the reality you bring out of potential with truth is good. And I think that's one of the most profound discoveries of humanity, the ability to articulate that idea. It was articulated in the first chapter in Genesis. It's a brilliant idea. And it's associated with the idea that human beings are made in the image of God, because
I wondered if we would get to this.
God is that which calls reality into being out of potential.
God is that which made jealousy into a good thing. Something which is very directly a human emotion, a human sense of feeling, very primal, instinctive feeling, an emotion we can almost detect in other animals. This reaction. You have a dog and you get between a dog and its chosen piece or its designated piece of whatever, of a kill or carcass, its favorite bone. What will happen?
Potential, but each of us do that as well in a
Yes,
small
yes.
way.
From
Well,
the-
that seems to me to just be true.
So made in my image is the whole, in the sense of property. I'm going to take this laterally for a second, but it's laterally to content I've already done on this channel. Property is something which bears the stamp of its creator, and something which is made in my image, therefore designates mankind as the property of that which it's made in the image of. Do you follow me? That's the religious mindset. That's what he is defending.
Of course, all things that are in the manifest world were once unmanifest.
Right.
And many of the things that are
So they're both cool with that.
unmanifest now will become manifest.
And we can choose that to some degree.
We have agency.
Well, we seem to, yeah. So we
seem
certainly
to have
treat each other
agency.
like we do. Yeah, well, and you know, if I treat you like you don't have agency,
To be fair, and thinking as when I was a younger person, when I was, how to put it, inclined to idealistic presentations or even utopian presentations. One of those utopian presentations which I did actually take to was to consider calling everybody else God, which comes from Stranger in a Strange Land, Robert A. Heinlein, Thou art God. That's where I got that idea.
you don't like it. It's not the grounds for a
To recognize the agency of others.
satisfactory long-term relationship.
While we're in the Old Testament, I want to ask you something I saw in the book of Job that seems right up your alley. I looked at this book. I can't remember who wrote it anymore. You may even know. I expect so you will. It was a book of engravings from the book of Job by the British writer and poet William Blake. Blake had done this series of engravings based on the trials and tests
course
that
he's all over
Job
the
went
lake,
through.
yeah.
In these series of engravings, Yahweh and Yahweh and Job are depicted as sort of identical. You know, though one's in a celestial realm, one's in a terrestrial realm. At the beginning of the image, Job and his family are depicted in front of the tree of life. The instruments hang in the trees. The animals are sleeping. By the end of the image, after these various trials, you know, after Job has been tested, and we're to assume, I suppose, that there's been this journey of self, capital S, realization through these trials. The instruments are being played, the animals are awake, you know, and there's a sort of a bright future, and there's some sort of astronomical stuff, i.e. the positioning of the sun and moon is somehow meant to be significant also, and the person that wrote this book is a Jungian. Now, the thing that struck me deep, and I've been struggling with it ever since, is there's a moment where Yahweh shows the behemoth and the leviathan to Job, and he says, "These I made as I made thee."
Right.
And then in this Jungian analysis of these engravings, the writer says that that God requires of us that we be good, that goodness itself may exist, that there is something beyond but comparable to neutrality in God the Creator, the idea of God the Creator.
See, it's funny that this person, Russell Brand, says that God's commandment is that thou shalt be good. That is not the commandment. If you're talking about this Old Testament, that I think that's what you're talking about, or what he seems to be talking about. If he's talking about that, then what God commands is that ye be righteous, so that you stand against some other evil, and thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Remember,
Creator. The image.
That's it's not because the witch isn't good. It's because she is evil and you are righteous that you not suffer the witch to live. The righteous shall not have a witch among them, is the way it looks, right? But if you want to be right, but he just wants to go good, bad, good and evil. Not satisfactory, friend.
The behemoth and the leviathan in these engravings is terrifying. The animalism of the
These engravings.
behemoth, its musculature, its rawness. The leviathan, sneaky, dark, deep, terrifying thing. This idea of agency and God, this relationship between the unmanifest and the manifest as achieved through an individual's relationship with truth and expression, seems
Truth and expression. So when you think you must be absolutely right, yeah, that's not dogma. True is not dogma. It's self-righteousness. Righteous. That's what we're talking about. Self-righteousness. This God ideal. Where jealousy comes from. Which has to do with jealousy. Let's not forget that.
to me that it was saying something that was right on the precipice
I
of
might as well play it as stranger in a strange land. And therefore, while thou art God, question your use for jealousy and wherein that derives, if you're made in something's image.
my ability to understand and certainly to convey.
Okay, so the first thing I would say is, well, one of the indications that you're open is the way that you phrased that question. Because there's like 30 things happening in that question all at the same time. And one of the things that creative people do is they throw out like images, because you're
I think it's called Gish Gallop if you're on the right.
the question was full of images. You're trying to map
I mean, if you're describing someone on the right, fundamentalist, religious.
territory that you don't understand. You say, here's an image and here's an image and here.
I'm not talking political right. I'm talking value right. Self-value.
Here's an image and here's an image, and there's something uniting all of those, but I don't know what it is. It's like, well, that's what artists do, by the way. And so that's a preliminary mapping of unexplored territory. And so we could take that apart a little bit. I mean, one of the things, so Job is objecting to his treatment because, of course, God has a bet with the devil, basically, that he can take Job down and make him curse fate. He basically bets the devil that he can turn Job into Cain. And God says, the devil bets God that he can turn Job into Cain by tormenting him. And God says, no, Job's a good man. No matter what you do to him, he won't lose faith.
Thus the phrase raising Cain doesn't only pertain to the Genesis accounts, but also to the book of Job.
In being. That's essentially the bet. And you think, well, that's a hell of a thing for God to do. But then, and Job objects
Yeah, it's not capricious at all. Right?
to God to some degree. And so,
I don't get no respect.
He's got his reasons, man. I mean, because everything's taken away from him. And God says, I made these things, the Leviathan. So that's like the terrible element of nature. And I
Comedy. It's not capricious at all.
made the behemoth, and maybe you could say that's the terrible element of society. It's like, how dare you question me?
What?
And that's a perfectly reasonable objection. It's like, really, you're going to, doesn't matter what happens, you're going to question God? Really? Well, so God objects to that. And then although Jung believed that Job actually had the moral upper hand in that description because God behaved rather reprehensibly in having a bet with the devil. And Jung wrote a book called Answer to Job, which is very much worth reading. It's quite a profound piece of work. But then you also wove into the question this idea of the ethical requirement to be good.
Yeah.
And there's something in that that's unutterably deep, because this is right at the limit of my ability to understand things too. So it's speculative beyond belief. But it seems to me that we are thrown challenges, and that in some sense those are best construed as tests of our ethical ability. So what Jung thought, his idea was something like this, that at the beginning of time people were unconscious, and that consciousness emerged with all of its catastrophes, consciousness of death, for example. And one way out of the burden of consciousness was to return to unconsciousness. You can do that with alcohol. You can do that by being dependent. You can do that by failing to grow up. You refuse.
Failing to grow up. There's another way of looking at that. You can do that by actually getting addicted to sleep as well, or becoming fairly catatonic. You're almost always in a certain brain state when you're catatonic, like half awake, half asleep. Goodness only knows what total perception they're dealing with, or if it's augmented in some way by a different brain state. They should continually monitor them and try to figure out what those states are.
Use the burden of consciousness by becoming unconscious again. But there's another way forward, which is to become even more conscious. So the idea would be a little bit of consciousness is like an illness. But if you
Woke.
you can expand that consciousness upwards enough, then it's something, it starts to become.
Russell sometimes talks about how he thinks of his connection to God as being able to connect him to everything around him. He understands, therefore, implicitly everything by empathic connection.
Something that is its own cure, and that partly what your goal is while you suffer through life is to heighten your consciousness to the point where everything gets integrated enough so that that's proper medication for the disease of self-consciousness. And Jung believed that was really that was one of the ideas that ran through the entire structure of Judeo-Christianity, although it wouldn't be limited to Judeo-Christianity. So it's more consciousness rather than less. It's more attention. And I think there's something to that. And some of that, see, the other thing you see in psychotherapy, for example, is that when you're trying to lead people forward out of the darkness, let's say.
I'm actually going to take a break right here. It's a good place to cut it. Where those black bars were. I think that's a pretty good indication that I should perhaps pick up this conversation from
See, the other
there.
There's something to that, and some of that.
Yeah, I'm gonna pick it up from 3708. Thanks for watching. I'll say that a few times. Just not now.